The sinkhole had been there for years. Elias Cutter knew it the way a man knows the bad tooth at the back of his mouth present, dull, something to work around. It sat in the northwest corner of his property, where the old sugar maple grove thinned out and the ground went soft after rain. A ragged mouth in the earth, maybe 12 feet across at its widest point, ringed by dead grass and the pale roots of trees that had slowly given up trying to anchor themselves to nothing. He had fenced it off when his son was small. Just cattle wire and a couple of T-posts driven into the surrounding clay, enough to keep the boy from curiosity and the livestock from a broken leg. That was 11 years ago. The boy was grown now, gone to college in Knoxville, and unlikely to come back to a farm that had spent the better part of a decade bleeding money. The livestock were gone too, sold off in 2 separate auctions that Elias still thought about on quiet evenings when he sat on the porch with a glass of water and watched the light leave the hills. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. He was 53 years old. He had the hands of a man who had worked outside every day of his adult life, thick at the knuckle, permanently darkened along the creases. He wore the same brand of work boots he had worn since he was 22 and replaced them every 3 years with an identical pair. His truck was a 2008 Ford with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked fine on the driver's side and not at all on the passenger's side, which had mattered less and less over the years as there was generally no one riding next to him. He was not a man given to self-pity about that. He simply noted it the way he noted most things, practically, and moved on. The farm was 340 acres in Laurel County, Kentucky, which sounds like a great deal of land and is, in fact, a great deal of land, though it does not always translate to a great deal of income. The southern portion was in timber, slow-growing hardwood that had value but not urgency. The eastern fields were good growing ground when there was rain, which there had not been enough of in 4 of the last 6 years. The northwest corner where the sinkhole sat was karst country, honeycombed underneath with the limestone caves that ran through this part of Appalachia the way veins run through a body, unseen and essential and occasionally dangerous. You could stand in the right field on a quiet morning and hear water moving underground. Elias had grown up hearing that sound. It no longer seemed remarkable to him. What had changed in the last year was the sinkhole's behavior. It had always been there, but it had been stable, a fixture of the landscape he could ignore. Then, in late September, after a week of heavy rain, it had grown. Not dramatically, not overnight in the dramatic way that made news, swallowing cars or sections of road. Slowly. He measured it one morning and found it had widened by almost 2 feet on the northern edge. He measured it again 2 weeks later and found the same. The earth was moving, opening, giving way to whatever was underneath. An agricultural extension agent he called told him this was not unusual in karst terrain after heavy rain years and suggested he look into a remediation contractor if he planned to use that corner of the property. Elias was not in a position to be paying remediation contractors. He had not been in a position to pay for much of anything for the better part of 4 years. The farm had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had cleared the south fields by hand. His father had added the timber acreage when prices were good. Elias had inherited both the land and the philosophy that a man did not sell what his family had built, and he had held to that through a divorce that cost him a settlement he could barely afford, through a hail season that destroyed 30 acres of hay, through the beef market trough that had sent the cattle to auction, through drought and equipment breakdowns and a property tax bill that had gone up 2 years running. He was not broke. Not quite. He had equity in the land and a line of credit he had used carefully. But he was the kind of financially tired that comes from years of small losses adding up faster than the small gains, the kind of tired that makes a man sit on his porch in the evenings not thinking about much of anything. He decided to fill the sinkhole himself. It was the first week of November. The air was cold in the mornings and the leaves were down, the maples in the northwest corner standing bare against a gray sky. He had rented a small excavator from an equipment place in London, Kentucky, and hauled it out to the field on a borrowed trailer. The plan was straightforward, or at least it seemed so. Dig out the loose material around the perimeter, assess what he was dealing with structurally, then backfill with compacted gravel and soil in layers. He had watched several videos on the process and consulted by phone with the extension agent, who had reiterated his suggestion about a professional contractor, which Elias had acknowledged politely and then set aside. He started work on a Tuesday morning. The ground around the sinkhole was softer than he had expected even this far into autumn. The excavator bucket cut through easily, pulling up pale clay mixed with dark limestone gravel. He worked in a rough circle around the perimeter, pulling material back from the edge to stabilize the rim before going deeper. The work was slow and methodical. He had a thermos of coffee in the cab and a country station on the radio that faded in and out with the hills. By mid-afternoon, he had cleared a working zone around most of the perimeter and was beginning to work the bucket down into the depression itself, checking the walls as he went. Karst sinkholes in this part of Kentucky generally bottomed out in one of two ways. Either they hit solid limestone bedrock within 10 or 15 feet and were relatively simple to fill, or they opened into a cave system and were a different matter entirely. He had assumed, without quite articulating the assumption, that this one would be the former. The farm was on elevated ground, not the creek bottom where the bigger cave systems tended to run. He had never seen any sign of significant cave activity on the property in 40-plus years of walking it. He was wrong about that. The bucket went down 7 feet, and then 8, and the walls remained soft clay and broken stone, no sign of bedrock approaching. At 9 feet, the bucket hit something that gave way differently than the material above it. Not with the dull thud of clay or the grate of limestone, but with a hollow sound, a sound that he felt as much as heard, a resonance that came up through the excavator's frame and into the seat and into his chest. He stopped, pulled the bucket back, looked down into the hole. The bottom was dark. The afternoon light did not reach past 7 or 8 feet. He climbed down from the cab, got a flashlight from the toolbox in his truck, and came back to crouch at the edge and shine it downward. The floor of the excavation was gone. Not collapsed, at least not visibly. The bucket had punched through what turned out to be a thin limestone shelf, a natural cap over an open void below. The light caught the broken edges of the shelf and then caught nothing. Just air, darkness, a space that extended further than the flashlight beam could make sense of. He moved the beam slowly. The walls of the void came into view, pale limestone, wet and gleaming, dropping away below the shelf's edge. He could not tell how far. His beam lost itself in the dark before finding a floor. He stood up and walked back to his truck and sat in it with the engine off for several minutes. He was not a man who frightened easily, but what he had felt in those minutes at the edge, looking down into that underground dark with the flashlight beam swallowed before it hit bottom, was something close to primal unease. The kind of feeling that is not quite fear, but is the older thing that fear descends from. He had known intellectually that the karst was down there, had known it his whole life in the abstract way you know things that have never presented themselves concretely. But abstract knowing and peering down through a broken shelf of stone into a darkness that had no apparent floor are different experiences. He called 911, not because he was in danger, but because it seemed like the right call when the ground opened under you and you could not determine what was underneath your land. The dispatcher, a woman who sounded professionally unexcited, asked if there was a structural emergency, if anyone was in danger of falling in. He said no, not at present. She said she would send someone out to assess, probably the county emergency management coordinator. He said that was fine and gave her the road address and the directions through the property gate. While he waited, he went back to the edge with the flashlight and looked again, more carefully this time. The limestone shelf he had punctured was maybe 6 inches thick. The void below it was real, extensive. The cave system he had never had reason to believe was beneath this corner of his land. He moved the light along the near walls of the cave as best he could from above. They were smooth in places and rough in others, the characteristic surface of waterworked limestone. The cave was not new. Nothing down there was new. Whatever he had opened into had been there long before he was born, long before his grandfather had cleared the south fields, long before anyone in his family had owned this land or known it existed. What the flashlight caught, in the last few seconds before he heard the county vehicle coming down the access road, stopped him cold. He was moving the beam slowly along the cave wall, maybe 15 feet below the broken shelf, when the light hit something that did not belong. A color that was not the gray and cream of limestone, not the brown of sediment, not the white of mineral deposits. He held the beam steady. Whatever it was sat on a natural ledge of stone, a horizontal protrusion in the cave wall, and it sat there in the way that placed objects sit, with a regularity of arrangement that had nothing to do with geology. He could not make out what it was from this angle. The beam was not strong enough, and the angle was wrong. But it was there, and it was not natural, and it had been down in the dark long enough that he could not guess what it was or how it had come to be there. He stood up when he heard the tires on the gravel. The county emergency management coordinator was a man named Roy Stratton, 40-something, heavy-set, wearing a county-issued jacket and carrying a hard hat he did not put on. He looked at the excavation, looked at the broken shelf, took a flashlight of his own that was considerably more powerful than Elias's, and crouched at the edge. After a long minute, he sat back on his heels and let out a breath. "Well," he said, "that's a cave." Elias agreed that it was. Stratton called it in on his radio, spoke briefly with someone about cave protocols and liability, and whether the State Geological Survey needed to be notified. He told Elias he needed to flag the area and keep people back, that no one should be going down there until the space was assessed by someone qualified, that cave systems were unpredictable and the air quality alone could be a concern in a sealed or partially sealed void. Elias said he understood all of that. He asked Stratton if he could borrow his flashlight for a moment. Stratton handed it over without asking why. Elias went back to the edge, positioned himself to get the best angle on the ledge he had seen before, and held the beam there. From this distance and this angle, with a light strong enough to cut through the dark properly, he could see it clearly. There were containers on that ledge. Metal containers, he thought, though they were heavily corroded or otherwise obscured. They sat in a row along the natural shelf as if someone had placed them there deliberately, which someone had, though when and why and who were questions he had no answer to. There were at least 4 of them visible, possibly more in the shadow beyond the reach of the light. He handed Stratton the flashlight back and said, quietly, that he thought there might be something down in that cave that needed a closer look. Stratton crouched again with the light and was silent for a long time. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think you're right about that." The Geological Survey sent a team out the following morning. 2 geologists and a cave assessor from the state. A woman named Dr. Patricia Hale who arrived in a vehicle with the University of Kentucky logo on the door and immediately asked to see the excavation before Elias had finished introducing himself. She was in her mid-50s, small and efficient in her movements, with the particular focused energy of a person who has spent a significant portion of their life underground. She looked down into the hole with the assessing eye of someone for whom caves were not alarming, but simply the terrain. It was Elias's land. Nobody went down without him, and he made that plain to Stratton before the geological team arrived. Stratton had checked and confirmed that under Kentucky law, a landowner had significant rights regarding what was discovered in caves beneath their property, though the situation would depend heavily on what was actually found. This was information Elias received with the same quiet steadiness with which he received most things, and then turned over slowly in his mind. Dr. Hale determined within an hour that the void was safe enough for a preliminary descent with appropriate equipment. The air tested adequately. The walls were stable. The cave system, from what she could assess from above, appeared to be a sealed pocket rather than an active flowing system, which meant it was not subject to flooding. She had brought gear. Elias had a basic rappelling setup from years back when his son had gone through a rock climbing phase. He asked to go down with her. She looked at him for a moment and then said fine. They rigged the descent carefully. Stratton stayed at the surface with his radio. The second geologist stayed at the surface as well. The cave assessor went down first, then Dr. Hale, then Elias. The descent was maybe 20 feet. The broken shelf was 3 feet above the actual cave ceiling in that section, and they lowered through both. When Elias's boots touched the cave floor and he unclipped from the rope and turned his headlamp to take in the space, he was quiet for a long time. The cave was roughly 40 feet across at its widest, and perhaps 60 feet long in the direction he could see clearly before the ceiling dropped and the passage narrowed. The floor was flat, compressed sediment that had the hard-packed quality of ground that had not been disturbed in a very long time. The walls were the classic Karst limestone, waterworked and layered, orange and cream and pale gray in the light of the headlamps. A thin vein of moisture ran down one far wall, but the floor beneath it was dry, the water absorbed into the sediment over what must have been decades. The ledge he had seen from above ran along the southern wall at about chest height, a natural protrusion of harder stone that jutted out from the cave wall like a rough shelf. And on it, Arranged in a row that was clearly intentional were the containers he had seen. He counted 7 of them as he walked along the ledge. They were metal boxes, roughly the size of large toolboxes or small trunks, each one sealed with a clasp or latch that had long since corroded. The metal itself was a deep reddish brown, the color of iron that has spent years in a wet environment, though as he looked more carefully, he could see that the corrosion was primarily on the outer surface. The seams of the boxes looked intact. Whatever was inside had been sealed against the moisture. Dr. Hale was already photographing methodically with a waterproof camera, moving from box to box, not touching, not opening, documenting first. The cave assessor, a younger man named Keith, was sketching the dimensions of the cave on a waterproof notepad, giving it the focused attention of a person doing a job they know how to do. Elias stood at the center of the cave and turned a slow circle with his headlamp. There were more objects beyond the boxes on the shelf. Against the far wall, partially collapsed under its own weight but still recognizable, was what appeared to be a wooden structure, a crate or a cabinet of some kind. The wood dark and soft with decay, but the shape still legible. Beside it, lying on the floor rather than elevated on the shelf, were 3 more metal containers, smaller than the ones on the ledge, and what appeared to be a canvas bag that had deteriorated so thoroughly it was little more than a shape. He crouched next to one of the floor containers without touching it and held his light close. The surface was rough with corrosion, but beneath the rust he could see markings stamped into the metal, a series of letters and numbers, a symbol he could not immediately identify. He did not touch it. There was also, he noticed as he stood and let his light sweep the full length of the cave, a very faint smell beneath the mineral smell of wet stone. Not rot, exactly. More chemical. The kind of smell that is associated with age and sealed metal and things that have been in the dark long enough to become something other than what they were. Dr. Hale finished her initial photographic survey and came to stand beside him. She was controlled in her expression in the way that scientific training sometimes produces, but he could see that she was affected by what she was looking at. The quality of her attention had changed. It was sharper, more careful. "Mr. Cutter," she said, "I think you need to call someone else before we go any further with this." He agreed with her. He climbed back up into the daylight and sat on the tailgate of his truck and drank the rest of his coffee from the thermos, which had gone cold. The field around him was November quiet. The excavator sat where he had left it, its bucket still positioned near the hole. The bare maples stood at the field's edge. A crow called once from somewhere in the timber and was answered by nothing. Stratton came and stood near him after a few minutes. He had been on the radio. He said the county sheriff's department had been notified and a detective would be coming out in the afternoon. This was protocol when objects of unknown origin were found in circumstances that could not be immediately explained. He said this with the careful phrasing of someone who was not trying to alarm. Elias acknowledged it with a nod. He was not alarmed. He had passed some point on the far side of alarm when he had stood in the cave and looked at those containers and understood, with the plain practical sense of a man who had worked physical land his whole life, that they had been placed there by someone, deliberately, and that whoever had placed them had not come back for them, and that whatever was inside had been meant to stay hidden. The sheriff's detective arrived at 2 in the afternoon. A woman named Sandra Okafor, who was younger than Elias had expected and considerably more calm than the situation seemed to warrant. She listened to his account, asked clear questions, wrote in a notepad, and then asked to see the cave. She was not equipped to descend. She crouched at the edge with Dr. Hale's flashlight and looked for a long time, and then stood and said, with the deliberateness of someone choosing words carefully, that she thought they should call in some additional expertise. The additional expertise arrived the following morning in the form of 2 agents from the FBI's Louisville field office, which was a thing that Elias sat with for the better part of a sleepless night before it happened. He was not a man with any experience of federal law enforcement. His dealings with government, insofar as they had been direct, ran to the USDA and the county tax assessor's office and the Rural Electric Cooperative. The arrival of 2 FBI agents at his farm gate at 8:30 in the morning with credentials and a portable lighting rig felt like a significant escalation from filling a sinkhole. Their names were Hester and Carano. Hester was the senior agent, a tall man in his late 40s with the particular stillness of a person who has learned to be patient for a living. Carano was younger, worked the technical equipment, spoke less. They were courteous and thorough. They descended into the cave with a lighting system that transformed the space, flooding it with white light that rendered the objects on the shelf and floor with a clarity that the previous headlamp surveys had not achieved. Elias went down with them. He had decided, without making a production of it, that he was going to be present for everything that happened on his land. Hester had not objected to this. In the full white light of the portable rig, the cave was different. Not larger or smaller, but more legible. The corrosion on the metal containers was more visible, the range of it, some boxes worse than others. The wooden structure against the far wall resolved itself into a collapsed cabinet or chest, the hinges still visible, but the sides caved in under the weight of the lid, the interior dark. The canvas bag on the floor had become at some point something less than a bag, a shape defined more by what it contained than by its own structure, the contents visible through the deteriorated fabric in rough outline. Hester circled the cave without touching anything, his hands in gloves but held at his sides. He spoke quietly to Carano, who photographed everything from multiple angles. He paused longest at the shelf with the 7 boxes, studying the markings on the nearest one. He turned to Elias. "Mr. Cutter, how familiar are you with this part of your property?" "Reasonably," Elias said. "I've walked every acre. Never had reason to think there was a cave system here. And your family has owned this land how long?" "Since 1947. My grandfather bought it after the war." Hester looked back at the shelf. The boxes were stamped, he said, not quite to Elias and not quite to himself. "Government issue. Military." He looked at Carano. "You're seeing what I'm seeing?" Carano said he was. Hester looked at Elias. He said, with the careful precision of someone delivering information that has significant weight, that he believed the containers in this cave were military in origin and likely predated the current ownership of the land. He said he could not say more than that until the contents were examined and the markings properly identified. He said this was going to take time and would need to proceed through the correct channels. He said Elias's cooperation was appreciated and his rights as the landowner were understood and would be respected throughout the process. Elias listened to all of this and then asked a single question. "How old do you think this is?" Hester looked at the boxes, at the wooden cabinet, at the degree of corrosion and decay across the full cave. He said, carefully, that he was not in a position to speculate definitively. But the markings, the style of the containers, the nature of the deterioration, all of it suggested, provisionally, that the material in this cave was very old. He paused. World War II era was a possibility he was not willing to rule out. That would make it 80 years, Elias said. At minimum, Hester said. Elias stood in the cave with the portable light filling every corner, the limestone walls wet and pale, the corrolled boxes on their shelf, the broken cabinet, the 70-year-old air or 80-year-old air that was now the same air he was breathing, and he said nothing more for several minutes. The formal excavation of the cave took 4 days. A team came in from the Kentucky Heritage Council and from the Army Corps of Engineers because certain classes of military material required their involvement. Dr. Hale remained throughout as the geological expert of record. Hester and Carano were present every day. Sandra Okafor from the Sheriff's Department came each morning and left each afternoon. Elias was present every day as well, from first light until the team secured the site in the evening. He had moved his truck to the field edge and sat in it during the portions of the process he could not observe directly. He brought coffee and sandwiches and ate them looking at the portable structures the team had set up around the excavation, the evidence tarps, the lighting cables running from a generator, the numbered flags marking the position of items before they were moved. It looked like an archaeological site, which, in a functional sense, it was. The boxes on the shelf were opened on the 3rd day. A specialist from the Army Corps attended specifically for this, a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Whalen, who had spent much of her career doing exactly this kind of work, assessing and cataloging military material discovered in civilian contexts, which was more common than most people understood. Old wars left things behind. Old wars left things in places where time had done a thorough job of hiding them. The first box she opened, after clearing the latch with a conservation-grade solvent and documented photography and a careful structural assessment of the box's integrity, contained paper, documents, wrapped in what had originally been oilskin but had decayed to a dark, fragile film over the material beneath. The paper itself had held up better than the oilskin. Whalen examined the top document through a magnifying glass without removing it from the box and said, quietly and carefully, that she was looking at an inventory manifest. She read from it, slowly. The language was the specific language of wartime logistics. Dates, quantities, codes, a signature at the bottom that she could not yet make out. The second box, opened with the same methodical care, contained something more immediate to the senses. Gold. Not loose. Not in any form that was casual or informal. Coins, in paper rolls that had long since disintegrated, leaving the coins loose within the box, stacked and arranged as they had originally been, but compressed by time into a single gleaming mass. They were American gold coins, $20 gold pieces, the kind that had been standard currency before the 1933 executive order had taken them out of circulation. Whalen turned one over with a gloved hand and read the date. 1924. She turned another. 1921. Another. 1928. Elias was at the cave entrance for this, not inside, watching through the frame of the entrance. He could not see the coin dates. He could not hear what Whalen said to Hester in the low voice she used. But he could see the quality of the attention in the cave change, the way every person in there oriented differently toward the second box, the way Hester straightened from his crouch, the way Carano stopped photographing for a moment and then resumed with more deliberate care. The third box contained more documents. The fourth contained what appeared to be certificates, official financial documents, the kind that represented claims on value rather than containing value directly. Their condition was better than the oilskin-wrapped papers in the first box. They had been sealed differently, with a secondary inner wrapping that had done a better job of excluding moisture. Whalen held one to the light and did not say what she saw for a long time. She handed it to Hester. He read it. He handed it to Carano, who read it and took a photograph of it before handing it back. Whalen set it down carefully and came to the cave entrance where Elias stood and looked at him with the expression of a person determining how to say something. "Mr. Cutter," she said, "I want to be transparent with you, within the limits of what I can say officially at this stage. What we are finding down here appears to be significant. The documents in the first box appear to be military financial records from the Second World War period. The gold coins are consistent with pre-1933 American currency that would have been legal government tender at the time. The certificates in the fourth box are what I would provisionally describe as bearer bonds, war-era financial instruments. I cannot tell you at this moment what they are worth or what their legal status is or what the full contents of the remaining boxes will be. What I can tell you is that this is not a small discovery." Elias looked at her. He asked how not small. She looked back at him with the contained expression of a person accustomed to speaking carefully. She said she was not yet in a position to quantify. He accepted that and went back to his truck and sat with his cold coffee. The remaining boxes were opened over the course of the following 2 days. By the time Lieutenant Colonel Whalen had cataloged the contents of all 7 boxes from the shelf, plus the collapsed cabinet which yielded additional documents and a quantity of currency notes so deteriorated as to be unrecoverable, plus the 3 smaller floor containers which turned out to hold a mixture of more coin and what appeared to be raw gold, shaped into small bars bearing no mint marking but unmistakably the right color and weight, the tint that the Army Corps had set up over the excavation site had taken on the quality of a place where very serious people were doing a very serious thing. Hester came to Elias's truck on the evening of the 4th day. He sat on the tailgate beside him, which was a departure from the professional distance he had maintained throughout, and he looked at the field for a moment before he spoke. He said that he was going to have to bring additional people in. Specialists from the Treasury Department, historians from a military records unit, potentially representatives from the Justice Department, because the nature of what had been found created a set of jurisdictional and legal questions that went beyond his field office's scope. He said this was not bad news for Elias. It was simply the procedural reality of what happened when something of this magnitude came to the surface. He said magnitude carefully, as if aware that he was using a word with scale built into it. Elias asked how long this process would take. Hester said he did not know. Weeks at minimum. Months was more likely. Elias asked what he was supposed to do in the meantime. Hester said he should do nothing with the northwest corner of the property, should allow the team to complete their work, should speak with an attorney who had experience in finder's law and government property law. He said this last part with a slight but deliberate emphasis that Elias understood to mean it was important advice, not a suggestion. He asked if Hester could tell him anything about the gold. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. The coins and the bars. Hester was quiet for a moment. He said, very carefully, that the gold in those boxes represented, at minimum, a substantial quantity. He did not define substantial. He said the coins alone, setting aside any historical premium they might carry given their age and context, represented significant face value in gold weight, and that the small bars, once assayed, would add to that. He said the documents and bonds were a separate and more complex question that he was genuinely not able to address at this stage. At this stage, Elias said. Hester nodded. Elias looked at the northwest corner of his field, at the excavation site with its tarps and cables and generators and careful people moving in and out, at the bare maples standing against the November sky. He had come to this corner of the farm to fill a hole. He had spent $300 renting an excavator and had cleared most of a day's work before the bucket had gone through a limestone shelf into a cave that had been sealed for the better part of a century. He was trying not to think yet about what the coins and bars and certificates might represent in terms of total value, because the numbers that kept forming in the back of his mind were numbers of a size he had no framework for. He was a man who thought in terms of acres and bushels and cattle prices and loan payments. The numbers trying to assemble themselves from what he had seen in that cave over 4 days were of a different order entirely. They were the kind of numbers that did not feel real until someone official said them out loud, and even then took time to become real. He asked Hester one more question before the agent left. He asked whether there was any preliminary indication of how the material had come to be in the cave, who had put it there and why. Hester said it was early to say anything definitive, but the nature of the documents, the style of the containers, the military markings, the coins' dates, all of it was consistent with a picture that had a general shape to it. He said that during and after the Second World War, there had been documented instances of military funds being moved outside official channels. Some of it was wartime complexity, the fog and improvisation of a government and military operating under extraordinary pressure. Some of it was more purposeful concealment, money that had been diverted, hidden, intended to be recovered by someone who had not recovered it. He said the cave's apparent seal, the fact that it had not been accessed from the surface in decades, suggested that whoever had placed the material there had either died or been prevented from returning or had simply left it and never come back. He looked at Elias. The land this cave sits under, he said, who owned it before your grandfather? Elias said he did not know specifically but could find out. The county records would have it. Hester said that finding out would be worth doing. He left, and Elias drove home through the dark November roads to a farmhouse that was 3 generations old and needed a new roof on the rear addition and had a kitchen that was exactly the same as it had been when his mother was alive and his father was alive, and the farm was a different kind of place, full of different kinds of noise. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He had a glass of water and then a second glass of water, and he looked at the surface of the table, which was the same table he had eaten breakfast at every morning of his childhood, worn smooth at the edges where generations of hands had rested. He thought about the extension agent's advice to call a contractor. He thought about the fence he had put up around the sinkhole 11 years ago to keep his son away from it. He thought about the crow he had heard that morning, calling once from the timber and getting no answer. He thought about the cave, about the white light flooding the limestone walls, about Lieutenant Colonel Whalen turning a gold coin in her gloved hand and reading off the year. 1924, 1921, 1928. About the quality of silence that had settled over the team when the fourth box was opened and the documents inside were read. He picked up his phone and called his son in Knoxville. It was late, but the boy answered on the second ring, the way he always did when the farm number came up, with a voice that was not quite alarmed but had the edge of someone prepared to hear difficult news, because difficult news from the farm was more common than the other kind. Elias said it was not anything bad. He said the boy should probably come home this weekend if he could manage it. He said there was something he needed to talk about in person. His son asked if it was the farm, if they were losing it. Elias said no. He paused. He said it was actually quite a lot further from that than he had ever expected to be. His son was quiet for a moment, and then said he would be there Saturday morning. Elias said good. He said drive careful through the mountains. He put the phone down and sat in the kitchen of his grandfather's house on his grandfather's land under which, 40 feet down through clay and broken limestone and a thin shelf of karst, 7 metal boxes and a quantity of raw gold, and a set of documents that federal agents were now treating with considerable seriousness were sitting in a cave that the world had forgotten about for 80 years, waiting in the dark with the patience of things that have no reason to be impatient. He finished his water and went to bed. He did not sleep well, but he slept. The attorney his neighbor recommended was a woman in London named Claire Ashford who had a practice that covered estate law and agricultural land matters and had, it turned out, handled one previous case involving mineral rights and cave systems in Laurel County, though nothing on this scale or with these complications. She was in her early 60s, direct in her speech, and she listened to Elias's full account on a Monday morning without interrupting except to ask 3 clarifying questions. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to be honest with you, Elias. I know the broad strokes of finder's law and government property law, but this is well outside normal agricultural practice. You need a specialist in both military property and federal recovery law. She named a firm in Lexington that handled federal property disputes and gave him a direct number. She also said, and this was the part he found himself returning to throughout the rest of that day, that regardless of how the legal questions resolved, the fundamental fact of what had been found on land his family had owned for 77 years, meant that his situation had changed in ways he could not yet fully see. He thanked her and drove home and called the Lexington firm from the kitchen table. That same afternoon, a man he did not know knocked on his farm gate. He was standing in the driveway beside a pickup that had a local county plate and a real estate company logo on the magnetic door sign. He handed Elias a card and said he had heard, through the normal routes that information traveled in a rural county, that there had been some kind of discovery on the Cutter property and that if Elias was at any point considering his options regarding the land, he would be very interested in discussing them. Elias looked at the card. He handed it back. He said he was not considering any options regarding the land. The man said he understood, of course, but that valuations had a way of changing when discoveries of this nature came to light, and he just wanted Elias to know the conversation was available. Elias said thank you. He said goodbye. He went inside and stood at the kitchen window and watched the pickup turn around in the driveway and go back down the road. This was Tuesday. By Thursday, he had received 3 more such visits and 2 phone calls from numbers he did not recognize. The news had moved, the way news moves in small counties, through the channels that have always carried it, hardware stores and church parking lots and the feed supply, growing as it moved, accumulating speculation, the way water picks up sediment as it travels, so that what arrived at each new pair of ears was larger and stranger than what had originally been reported. He stopped answering the gate and let the calls go to voicemail. He drove out to the northwest corner each morning and checked that the Corps of Engineers' security measures around the site were intact. He helped his son, who had come on Saturday as promised and had stood at the edge of the excavation for a long time not saying anything, begin the county records research that Hester had suggested. It took 3 days of going through the Laurel County courthouse archives, physical records, old deed books with marbled covers, transfer documents in the specific legal language of property conveyance, tax records going back to the early decades of the previous century. What they found, on the third afternoon of searching, stopped them both. The land that was now the northwest corner of the Cutter farm, the 40 acres that included the maple grove and the sinkhole field, had not always been part of what his grandfather had purchased in 1947. His grandfather had bought the main farm holding from a family named Weston. The northwest parcel had been added in a separate transaction 6 months later, in early 1948, and had been purchased not from the Weston family, but from the estate of a man named Harold Ogle, who had died in December of 1947. Harold Ogle had acquired the northwest parcel in 1939 from a foreclosure sale. Prior to that, it had belonged to a man named Frederick Sander, who had owned it since 1931 and had apparently defaulted on a tax obligation during the Depression years. Elias's son ran the name Frederick Sander through the courthouse index and then through the newspaper archives they accessed through the public library's digital database. He found 2 items. One was a brief notice from 1931 recording the deed of transfer for a property purchase. The other was a death notice from 1944 in a Knoxville newspaper. It identified Frederick Sander, age 47, formerly of Laurel County, Kentucky, as having died in a military hospital in England, following wounds received in France during the Normandy campaign. It noted that he was survived by no immediate family. Elias read it twice. His son sat beside him and read it as well. A man who had bought this land in 1931, lost it in a foreclosure in 1939, gone to war in the years that followed, and died in 1944 of wounds received in France. He would not have been able to come back for it, Elias said. His son said nothing. He would have died thinking it was still there, Elias said, or not thinking about it at all. Men who were dying of wounds had other things on their minds. His son asked what they were going to do with this information. Elias looked at the death notice, at the name and the dates and the brief accounting of a life that had ended in an English military hospital with no family to receive the news. He said they were going to give it to Hester. All of it. The deed records, the foreclosure notice, the death notice, everything. He said it was part of the story of how things came to be where they were, and the story needed to be complete. His son asked if that might complicate the legal situation. If knowing the former owner had died intestate and without heirs affected the question of who the contents of the cave might legally belong to. Elias said it probably did complicate things. He said most things worth doing were complicated. They drove back to the farm in the last of the afternoon light with the county records copied and organized in a folder on the back seat. The hills above the road were the bare gray and brown of late November, the last few oak leaves holding on, the sky the particular pale color of late autumn that carried winter in it. He thought about Frederick Sander on the drive home, a man he had never heard of, who had owned a corner of what was now his land for 8 years, who had lost it in the Depression and gone to war and died in France of wounds that had finished him in England, which was a long way from Laurel County, Kentucky. A man who had, at some point before losing the land or after losing the land, found or known of a cave on the northwest parcel and placed metal boxes in it in the dark, or who had not placed them, who had found them already there, or been asked to store them, or been given them for reasons that the documents inside might or might not explain. The full story was not yet readable from what they had. The documents Whalen had photographed and was now having analyzed in a facility in Louisville might tell more. Or they might not. 80 years was a long time for stories to lose their connective tissue, for the people who knew the why and the how to have gone beyond the reach of being asked. What remained was the physical fact of the cave and what it contained, sitting under 40 acres of Laurel County farmland that a man named Elias Cutter had owned for the past 18 years, which his father had owned before him, which his grandfather had assembled from 2 separate purchases in 1947 and 1948. One of which had been the estate sale of a man who died of something else before the world figured out what to do with what he may or may not have known was underneath it. The sky went dark during the drive, the way it did in November, quickly and without ceremony, and by the time he turned the truck down his driveway the stars were visible and the temperature had dropped, and he could see his breath when he climbed out and stood for a moment looking at the farm, the dark fields and the dark timber and the pale shape of the barn against the sky. His son came and stood beside him. Whatever this turns out to be, his son said, "You're not selling the farm, right?" Elias said no. He said it the way he said things that did not require much deliberation. He said the farm was the farm. Whatever else this became, the farm was still the farm. His son nodded. They went inside. Across the field to the northwest, behind the fence of bare maples, under the November ground, the cave sat in the dark with its 7 boxes and its raw gold and its documents that nobody had read in 80 years, patient as the stone it was carved through, waiting for the next morning when the people with credentials and equipment would come back and continue the careful work of bringing it into the light. The Treasury Department specialists arrived on a Wednesday, 9 days after the initial discovery. There were 3 of them, 2 from the Financial Crimes Unit and 1 from a division whose full title Elias never quite caught, but whose function, as best he understood it, was the assessment and authentication of historical government financial instruments. They drove up from Louisville in a black SUV and brought cases of equipment that they carried into the tent over the excavation site with the brisk efficiency of people who had done this before. Though Hester told him privately that a find of this specific nature was not something his field office had encountered previously, and that the Treasury team's presence indicated the seriousness with which the contents of the cave were being treated at the federal level. Elias noted the phrase at the federal level and turned it over in his mind for the rest of that day. His son had stayed through the weekend and then gone back to Knoxville on Sunday evening. Before leaving, he had printed out a summary of the county records research and organized it in the folder his father kept on the kitchen table alongside the cards of the attorneys and the agents and the geological team members he had accumulated over the preceding 2 weeks. The folder had grown thick. He leafed through it sometimes in the evenings without reading any of it carefully, just registering its presence, the way a man registers the weight of a thing he is carrying before he decides how far he intends to carry it. The Treasury team spent 3 days in the cave and in the tent, working with the photographs and preliminary documentation that Whalen's team had produced, and then working with the objects themselves, the documents, the certificates, the coins, the bars. Elias was present on the perimeter of this work each day, allowed close, but not inside the active work zone. He watched through the tent opening when he could, which gave him partial views of people bent over tables with magnifying equipment and chemical testing kits, and the specific absorbed posture of people doing skilled work that required full attention. On the 3rd evening, the senior Treasury specialist, a man named Warren Fitch who wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck and had the manner of a senior academic rather than a federal agent, came out of the tent and found Elias at his truck and asked if they could talk. They sat on the tailgate in the cold November air. Fitch had a clipboard with papers on it that he held but did not consult, as though he had already committed what he needed to say to memory. He began with the coins. He said the gold $20 pieces were Liberty Head and St. Gaudens double eagles, minted between 1900 and 1932. The dates were consistent with pre-1933 currency, which meant they had been legal tender at the time of their original acquisition. The quantity was significant. He had completed a preliminary count and assessment and was looking at approximately 460 coins. At current gold spot price, setting aside any numismatic premium, that represented a substantial base value. He paused on that phrase the way Hester had paused on magnitude, with a deliberateness that indicated the word was doing intentional work. He said the raw gold bars were a more complex matter. They bore no mint marking, which meant they had not been produced by a government facility. They had been assayed in the field with portable equipment and were high-purity gold, consistent with refined gold, not raw ore. The total weight of the bars was something he would not specify at this stage, but he said the weight combined with the purity put them in a category that was, his word again, significant. Then he came to the documents and the bonds. He set his clipboard on the tailgate between them and looked at the field for a moment before he spoke. The documents in the first box, he said, were military financial records. Specifically, they were records relating to a wartime financial operation that had been conducted out of this region in 1943 and 1944. He said there had been, during the war, various programs involving the movement of assets, both to protect them from potential enemy action and to fund certain operations that were handled outside standard military budget channels. Most of these programs were documented in the National Archives. Some were not. Elias asked which category these documents fell into. Fitch said that was precisely what made this complicated. The operation referenced in the documents appeared in partial form in the National Archives records, but only in partial form. Key portions of the record appeared to be missing from the official archive, which could mean several things. It could mean the records had been lost or destroyed in the course of normal wartime record keeping, which was common. It could mean they had been deliberately removed. It could mean they were filed under a classification that had not yet been fully declassified. What he could say with confidence was that the documents in the cave corroborated the partial archive record in ways that were specific and verifiable. They were authentic. They were original. And they referenced a sum of government money that had been, in the language of the wartime documents, temporarily relocated for security purposes in the spring of 1944. Temporarily relocated, Elias said. Fitch said yes. Elias asked what the sum was. Fitch looked at his clipboard, though he still did not consult it. He said the documents specified a figure in 1944 dollars. He said he was going to give Elias that figure without at this time offering any judgment about what it meant in current terms, because the conversion question was legally and jurisdictionally complex, and was not his determination to make. He said the figure in the documents was $480,000 in gold-backed currency and negotiable bonds, plus an unspecified quantity of physical gold whose weight was not documented in the records he had. Elias said $480,000 in 1944. Fitch said yes. Elias understood enough about historical currency conversion to understand that this was not $480,000 in present terms. He did not ask what it was in present terms because Fitch had just told him that was not a determination he was making today. Instead, he asked who the money had belonged to. This, Fitch said, was the central question, and the answer had layers. The formal record described the funds as government operational money, which meant, in the strictest legal reading, federal property. However, the specific program under which it had been designated had been a wartime authorization that was never formally closed, which created a question about whether the authorization's legal standing had lapsed. Additionally, the manner in which the funds appeared to have been moved, based on what the documents described, raised questions about whether the chain of lawful custody had been maintained. And then there was the question of what had happened to the person or persons responsible for the relocation, which was to say, whether they had been authorized to move the funds to this specific location or whether the relocation represented an unauthorized act. Which would make it, Elias said. Fitch said he was not going to characterize it at this stage. Elias said he understood. They sat on the tailgate in the cold for another minute. An owl called from the timber at the far edge of the field. The generator for the tent hummed steadily. Elias asked whether the man whose name appeared on the documents, the person responsible for the relocation, had been identified. Fitch said yes. He had been. The signature on the primary document, once enhanced and cross-referenced against military records, matched a warrant officer who had been stationed at a logistics depot in southeastern Kentucky in 1943 and 1944. His name was in the military record. His service history was retrievable. He had been discharged in late 1945, a year after the Normandy campaign, due to wounds, and had died in 1947. Elias asked for the name. Fitch said Frederick Sander. Elias looked at the tent and at the portable lights and at the bare maples at the field edge and said nothing for a long time. The same name, he said finally. The same name, Fitch confirmed. The man who owned this parcel before your grandfather bought it, and the warrant officer responsible for the relocation in the documents appear to be the same person, which is consistent with the hypothesis that Sander moved the funds to a location he had personal knowledge of and access to, this property, and either intended to return for them or intended to report the relocation and was prevented from doing so by his death. Elias said he had found the death notice in the newspaper archives. Died in an English military hospital in 1944 of wounds received in France. Fitch nodded slowly. He said the timing was consistent. He said that if Sander had relocated the funds in the spring of 1944 and then been wounded in France in June of 1944 and died of those wounds, he would not have been in a position to report or recover. He said this was speculation at this point, but was the working hypothesis. Elias asked whether there was any record of the funds having been reported missing. Fitch said there were partial records of an inquiry in 1945, a question raised in the logistics depot's post-war audit about a discrepancy in the operational accounts. The inquiry had been closed without resolution, attributed to wartime record-keeping irregularities. He said these things happened. The scale of government financial operations during the war was enormous, and the record-keeping, while generally good, was not perfect. A discrepancy of this size, in the context of the full operation, had apparently not been pursued aggressively. Or the people who might have pursued it had not survived the war either. He picked up his clipboard. He said he was going to need several more days to complete the formal assessment and that his written report would go up through Treasury channels. He said Elias's attorney of record would receive a copy of the public portions of the report. He said the legal process from here would involve multiple agencies and likely take months. He said one more thing before he stood up. He said that regardless of how the jurisdictional and legal questions resolve, the physical fact of the discovery, the quantity of gold, the denomination of the bonds, the historical significance of the documents, was going to attract attention. Some of that attention would be from people with legitimate interests. Some of it would be from people with other kinds of interests. He said Elias should be thoughtful about what he said to whom and should direct all official inquiries to his attorney and all media inquiries to no one, at least for the time being. Elias said he had already received 4 visits from real estate interests in the past week. Fitch said that was faster than expected, but not surprising. He said again, get a good attorney. He went back to the tent. Elias drove home in the dark. The attorney from Lexington was named Robert Calloway. He had been doing federal property law for 22 years and had handled 3 previous cases involving the discovery of government property on private land, though none involving wartime financial instruments and none of this magnitude. A word he used without apparent discomfort in a way that told Elias he was a man accustomed to speaking plainly about things that other people found difficult to quantify. He drove to the farm rather than asking Elias to come to Lexington, which Elias registered as a mark in his favor. They sat at the kitchen table with the thick folder between them, and Calloway went through it methodically, reading the documents in the order they had been accumulated, asking questions at intervals. He had a legal pad on which he made notes in a compact hand. He drank 2 cups of coffee. When he finished with the folder, he set his pen down and said, "Let me tell you what you're dealing with." Elias said, "Please." Calloway said there were 3 distinct legal threads, and they needed to be kept separate because conflating them would create confusion that would benefit everyone except Elias. The first thread was the gold, the coins and the bars. Physical gold on private land in Kentucky, discovered by the landowner in the course of legitimate agricultural work. Under Kentucky law and under federal common law principles applied in similar cases, physical property found on private land by the landowner had a strong presumption of belonging to the landowner, particularly where the original owner could not be identified with certainty or where the chain of custody had been broken. The government could assert a claim based on the wartime documents, but the strength of that claim depended on whether the relocation had been authorized, and the documents, from what Calloway had read in Fitch's preliminary summary, did not clearly establish authorization. They established that Sander had moved the funds. They did not clearly establish that he had been directed to move them here. The second thread was the bonds. Bearer bonds, if that was what they were more complex because their legal status had changed over the decades. The original bonds would have had specific terms of redemption. Whether those terms were still operative, whether the bonds could be redeemed at full face value, whether accrued interest applied, whether the government would honor them at all given their provenance, were all open questions that would require substantial legal work and probably litigation. He said he was not going to pretend these were going to be simple to resolve, but he was also not going to pretend they were worthless. They were not worthless. They represented a claim that could be argued. The third thread was the documents themselves. The military financial records. These were almost certainly government property regardless of the circumstances of their movement. Elias would not be claiming ownership of those, but their contents, the information they contained, the history they documented, could be relevant to the other 2 threads, and his access to that information and the way it was eventually made public or kept confidential could be negotiated as part of any settlement process. He picked his pen back up. He said, "The thing you need to understand is that the government is going to want this resolved quietly and efficiently and in a manner that does not create public questions about wartime financial management that could be embarrassing. That gives you leverage. Not because you want to embarrass anyone, but because the desire for a quiet resolution means they have incentive to offer you a reasonable settlement rather than fight every threat in court for the next decade." Elias asked what a reasonable settlement looked like. Calloway said it was too early to put a number on it. He said the total value of the physical gold at current prices, plus the bond question, plus the numismatic premium on the coins, plus the historical significance of the documents, were elements that added up to a figure he could estimate, but did not want to estimate yet, because the estimate would affect Elias's expectations, and he preferred Elias's expectations to be shaped by reality rather than by optimism. Elias said he could handle a realistic number. Calloway looked at him for a moment. He said that based on what he had read and what Fitch's preliminary assessment described, the physical gold alone, the coins at numismatic auction value plus the bars at current gold price, was in the range of several $1,000,000. He said the bonds, if they could be redeemed at anything close to face value with accrued interest calculated from 1944, could represent multiples of that. He said he was not going to go further than that at this stage, but he wanted Elias to understand that when he said the government had incentive to resolve this quietly, he was not talking about a situation worth tens of thousands of dollars. He was talking about a situation worth considerably more. Elias sat with that. He asked Calloway what he should do in the meantime. Calloway said, "Don't sell the land. Don't talk to the press. Don't talk to the real estate people who were going to keep knocking on his gate. Don't make any financial decisions on the basis of money he had not yet received and might not receive in its full form. Live his life." Elias said he was good at living his life. Calloway said he could see that. He drove back to Lexington and Elias sat at the kitchen table after he left and looked at the bare surface where the folder had been. He had given the folder to Calloway to take. The table looked the way it had always looked, worn at the edges. The grain of the oak faded to gray in the places where the light hit it every morning. Several $1,000,000. Multiples of that. He had been $60,000 in debt 14 months ago. A line of credit against the land, drawn down in 2 installments to cover operating costs and the settlement from his divorce. He paid the interest monthly and had been paying it for 3 years. $60,000 at the interest rate he was carrying had felt, for those 3 years, like a weight he walked around with every day. Not crushing, not unbearable, but present, the way the bad tooth at the back of the mouth was present, always there when he pressed his tongue against it. He did not press his tongue against this. He sat with it at arm's length and tried to keep his thinking practical. The news broke, in the way that news broke in the modern world, not through any single point of disclosure, but through the accumulation of small leaks across enough separate sources that the full picture assembled itself in public before any official statement had been made. Elias learned it had broken when his son called on a Saturday morning and said, "Dad, you're on the internet," which was a sentence with no precedent in their relationship. A county commissioner had mentioned it at a city council meeting. A crew member from the Geological Survey had spoken to someone. A food service worker at the diner in London had overheard a conversation between 2 of the Army Corps people. By the time it reached the regional news websites, it had acquired the specific distortions that such stories accumulate in transit. The numbers were larger than any official estimate. The circumstances were more dramatic. The suggestion was that Elias had personally descended into the cave and emerged carrying gold bars in his arms, which was not how it had gone. He did not respond to the calls that started arriving that Saturday and did not stop. He let the gate stay locked and directed everything to Calloway's office as he had been told to do. His son drove up from Knoxville again, unasked, and arrived Sunday afternoon, which Elias was grateful for in the quiet way he was grateful for most things. They sat on the porch in the December cold, and his son showed him some of what had been written online, and Elias read it with the interest of a man reading a story about someone he did not entirely recognize as himself. The facts were approximately right in their architecture, but wrong in their texture. The man described in the articles, a lucky farmer who had stumbled onto a fortune, bore a surface resemblance to him, but missed the part that felt true, which was that the fortune, if it was a fortune, was not luck in the simple way the articles implied. It was the accumulated consequence of his grandfather having bought a specific parcel of land 77 years ago from a dead man's estate, his father having held it through difficult decades, and Elias having held it further through his own difficult decade, and the sinkhole having grown at this specific time rather than 5 years earlier or 10 years later, and his having rented an excavator rather than hiring a contractor, and the bucket having gone through the shelf at this specific angle and depth rather than a foot to the left where the bedrock was solid. It was luck, but it was luck that had required 77 years of other decisions to bring it to the surface. His son read a comment on one of the articles from someone who said the government would just take it all anyway, and what was the point? He read another from someone who said that Elias should donate everything to a national museum and be proud of the history. He read a third from someone who said they were a descendant of Frederick Sander and planned to file a claim, which caused Elias to look up from the porch railing and raise his eyebrows. And his son said he had sent that comment to Calloway already. Calloway's response had been swift and practical. He said that a claim based on descent from Sander would face significant obstacles. Sander had died in 1944. He had been reported as having no surviving immediate family at the time of his death. The property had been sold out of his estate before he died, during his foreclosure in 1939, which meant he had not owned it when the funds were placed there, or at least not owned it when they could have been recovered. The legal thread connecting a modern-day descendant to assets hidden by a dead man in a cave on land that man no longer owned was thin to the point of theoretical. Calloway said he would monitor it, but was not concerned. What Calloway was more focused on, as he explained in a phone call that week, was the preliminary response from the Treasury Department, which had come through official channels and indicated that the government was prepared to initiate a formal claims process. He said the language of the response was careful and professional and contained nothing alarming. He said the fact that they had responded formally and promptly rather than simply asserting full ownership and leaving Elias to fight it suggested they were aware of the legal complexity and were approaching it with appropriate caution. He said, "They know you have a case. They're not sure how strong it is, and neither are we, but they're not going to steamroll you." Elias asked if he should be worried. Calloway said not yet. The weeks that followed had a strange double quality. On one side was the official process, methodical and slow, the kind of institutional momentum that moves at its own pace regardless of urgency. The cave was fully documented and the contents transferred to a secure federal facility in Louisville for proper analysis. The Army Corps of Engineers signed off on the structural assessment of the cave itself. The Geological Survey completed its report. The Treasury team's formal assessment was filed. Calloway received the relevant portions and reviewed them and reported back to Elias in weekly calls that were calm and informative and which Elias appreciated for their lack of drama. On the other side was everything else. The gate continued to receive visitors who were turned away. The phone received calls from journalists, from treasure hunters, from a television producer who wanted to film a documentary, from two separate law firms claiming to represent descendants of the original wartime logistics operation who believed they had interests in the recovered assets, from a man who called 3 times claiming to be Frederick Sander's grandson despite the death notice's clear statement that Sander had died without family, and from a woman in Ohio who said that her late husband had worked at the same wartime logistics depot as Sander and had told her something once about a hiding place, and could she meet with Elias to discuss it. That last call he mentioned to Calloway, who said it was potentially interesting and probably nothing, but passed it to Hester at the FBI, who called the woman and spoke with her for 40 minutes, and then reported back that her recollection was vague and mostly comprised of a story her husband had told in a general way, nothing specific enough to constitute a claim or a lead, though it confirmed that the wartime movement of the assets had been known to at least one other person at the time, which was consistent with the document's references to personnel involved in the relocation. Elias drove to London for groceries and hardware and the other small errands of a farm in winter. People looked at him differently than they had in October, the particular look that attaches to a person whose circumstances have become publicly known in a way that separates them from ordinary life. Some people were warm, genuinely warm, the pleasure of someone else's good fortune landing cleanly. Some were careful, measuring, figuring out what he might owe them or what attitude was appropriate. A few were cool in a way that he had not anticipated and could not entirely account for, but that had the quality of resentment, as if the cave and its contents were something he had arranged unfairly. He found he did not mind any of these reactions particularly. They were all human reactions to an unusual situation, and he had no quarrel with them. He bought his groceries and his hardware and drove home through the December hills. His neighbor, a man named Carl Pruitt whose farm ran along the eastern boundary, came over one afternoon with a bottle of good bourbon and sat at the kitchen table and said he had heard and wanted to say congratulations and leave it at that, which was exactly the right response, and which Elias appreciated so much that they sat for 2 hours drinking moderate amounts of the good bourbon and talking about the farm and the timber market and Pruitt's daughter's new baby, which was 3 weeks old, and apparently remarkable. At no point during those 2 hours did Pruitt ask about the money. At no point did he suggest anything or hint at anything or maneuver the conversation toward his own interests. He sat at the table in Elias's grandfather's kitchen and talked about the things farmers in Laurel County talked about in December and then went home. Elias sat after he left and thought about that, about what it said about a man that he could do that, and decided it said something good. The formal assessment from the Treasury team was completed in January and transmitted to Callaway in its public portions. Elias sat with Callaway in London at his attorney's office on a gray Thursday afternoon and listened to it read aloud. The physical gold, coins and bars combined, had been assessed at a current value in the range of $7 to $9 million, depending on the method of sale and the numismatic auction premium on the rarer coin dates. The range was wide because the market for this class of collectible gold was variable, and a sale of this quantity would itself affect the market in ways that were difficult to predict exactly. The bonds were more complicated. They had been examined by Treasury specialists and by independent authenticators retained by Callaway's firm. They were authentic. They were original instruments from the wartime period. Their face value in 1944 dollars was approximately $420,000, which was the figure that matched the document's reference to the total relocation. The question of whether they were still redeemable and at what effective value was a legal and financial question that could not be settled by authentication alone. Callaway said the bond question was going to be the center of the negotiation. He said the government would resist full redemption with accrued interest because the interest calculation from 1944 to the present produced a number that was very large. He said his job was to argue for as close to full redemption as the law and the circumstances would support. Elias asked what the number was. The full redemption with interest number. Callaway said he had had it calculated by a financial historian at the University of Kentucky who specialized in wartime economic analysis. He said the methodology was defensible and the figure was the figure, though it would be argued strenuously by the government. He told Elias the number. Elias sat with it. He said, after a moment, "That's more than the farm is worth." Callaway said yes. He said it was more than the farm had been worth in 3 generations of his family owning it. Callaway said yes. He asked if it was realistic that the number would hold anywhere near that level through the negotiation. Callaway said probably not the full figure. He said the government would argue that the bonds had been government operational funds improperly removed from authorized custody, that the interest calculation was not applicable in the same way it would be for standard government bonds, and that the public interest in the historical record of the wartime operation should be taken into account. He said these were not unreasonable arguments, and some of them would likely have traction with a federal judge if it came to that. He said it was unlikely to come to that. He said the government preferred settlement, and so did he, and the settlement figure would be less than the full calculation, but more than the physical gold alone. Elias asked what he was working toward. Callaway said he was working toward a settlement that valued the physical gold at market price with full ownership transferred to Elias, a bond redemption at a negotiated percentage of face value plus a portion of the accrued interest, and a formal recognition of Elias's cooperation and good faith in the discovery and reporting process, which he intended to argue should result in a finder's consideration above and beyond the asset value. He said, again, he would not name a figure because the figure would shape expectations, and he wanted expectations shaped by outcomes rather than projections. But he said Elias should understand that the situation was not trivial. That was his word. Not trivial. Elias drove home through January cold with the heater working on his side of the truck and not on the passenger side, the familiar asymmetry of a 12-year-old vehicle with a familiar problem. The hills were white where the snow had stayed in the shadowed north-facing slopes. The road down to his farm was clear, the county plow having come through that morning. He had a number in his head that he could not fully make real yet. He had been trying to make it real since Callaway had said it in that careful, steady way attorneys had of delivering large information without drama. He kept converting it into things he understood, into acres and years and the line of credit balance and the roof on the rear addition, and it kept exceeding those conversions easily and having room left over. That was the problem with a number of this size. It did not fit inside the frameworks he had built for numbers over 53 years of a practical life. He turned down his driveway and parked and sat in the truck for a minute looking at the farmhouse. 3 generations of his family had come home to this house. His grandfather had come home to it from buying the northwest parcel in 1948. The parcel that had included a sinkhole nobody knew was a cave entrance. The cave that had been sealed since at least 1944 and maybe earlier, sitting in the dark under 40 acres of Kentucky farmland through the entirety of 3 generations of Cutter men working the land above it. His grandfather had not known. His father had not known. He had not known until the bucket went through the shelf. Frederick Sander had known, or had known enough. Had known there was a cave and had used it, in the spring of 1944, for a purpose that the documents described in the specific bureaucratic language of wartime logistics, language that covered something Callaway had called complex, that Fitch had called a question of authorized custody, and that Elias privately had come to think of simply as a man making a decision under pressure and then dying before he could either justify it or undo it. He did not know what to think about Frederick Sander. He had thought about him a fair amount over the weeks since the name had appeared in the courthouse archives and again in Fitch's report. He had looked up what he could find, which was not much. The military records were partial. The personal history before the war was thin. A man from southeastern Kentucky who had worked in some capacity involving finance or accounting before being commissioned as a warrant officer in 1942. He appeared in the logistics depot records for 1943 and 1944 and then disappeared from those records when the Normandy campaign made them irrelevant or when Sander himself was removed from the operational picture by the wound in France. He appeared once more in the death notice, and then he was gone from the record entirely. Elias had looked at the photograph in the death notice several times. It was the small, poor-quality reproduction that wartime newspapers had used, a man in uniform with a face that was not quite clear enough to read as a face. He was 37 years old in the photograph. He had no family at his death. He had owned a corner of a Kentucky farm that he had lost to foreclosure 5 years before the war, and that he had, apparently, found a use for after losing it. What use precisely was still not entirely clear. The documents established that the funds had been moved. They did not clearly establish why, whether it was an act of protection, an act of theft, an act of something more complicated that sat between those two things in the moral territory that wars created and that peacetime had trouble accounting for. Elias did not know. Callaway did not know. Hester did not know. Fitch had the most informed opinion, and his opinion, offered once and not repeated, was that the wartime picture was unlikely to be simple in any direction and that simple judgments about it were probably wrong. Elias had come to agree with that. He went inside and made dinner, which was the same as it usually was, something simple and sufficient, a man feeding himself at the end of a working day. He ate at the kitchen table where Callaway had sat, where Carl Pruitt had sat with the bourbon, where the folder had been. He ate without thinking about the number, which was an act of discipline he had been practicing and which he was getting better at. His son called while he was washing up. They talked for 20 minutes. His son asked how it was going, and Elias said it was going in the way these things went, steadily, and without clear resolution yet. His son asked if he was all right, and Elias said he was all right. His son said he was proud of him, which was a thing his son did not say often and which landed differently than Elias expected, less as a compliment and more as a recognition, as if his son was acknowledging something specific about how his father had conducted himself through this, the steadiness, the refusal to be turned by the real estate people or the journalists or the scale of the number. He said thank you and told his son to drive careful when he came up in February. He went to bed at the time. He always went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while as he had been doing most nights since November, not quite sleeping, turning things over. The farm, the cave, Sander's photograph, Callaway's number, his grandfather buying the northwest parcel in 1948 from a dead man's estate, not knowing what he was buying, not in any way he could have known. The owl was back in the far timber. He could hear it through the window he left cracked even in January, the old habit of a man who had grown up in this house before central heating made it unnecessary. It called 3 times and stopped. He thought about what Callaway had said in passing, almost as an aside, during one of their weekly calls. He had said that in his experience, cases like this, meaning cases involving unexpected discovery of significant value, had a way of revealing character. The character of the institutions involved, the government agencies, the legal process, but also the character of the individuals. He had said that in his experience, the people who came through these situations well were not the people who had the most aggressive attorneys or the most strategic instincts. They were the people who knew what they wanted and could separate that from what they didn't want. He had asked Elias what he wanted. Elias had said without much hesitation, to keep the farm, to pay off what I owe, to be fair with whatever this is, and to know that whatever Sander was trying to do with that money, however it came out in the end, he gets some recognition for the fact that he didn't walk away from it. Calloway had been quiet for a moment. Then he said that was a clear answer and a good one. It was still the answer in January, lying in the dark with the owl and the timber and the farm around him in the cold. Keep the farm. Pay what was owed. Be fair. Recognize the man who had put the thing in the cave and died before he could either explain or retrieve it. These were not complicated things to want. They were the things a man who had spent 53 years working physical land and paying his debts and staying put wanted. They were proportionate to who he was in a way that the number Calloway had mentioned was not yet proportionate, was not yet integrated into his sense of himself in a way that felt solid. He was working on that. He expected it would take time. He slept. February came, gray and cold, with ice on the access roads that made the farm feel more remote than usual. His son came up for a long weekend, and they cut and stacked firewood and replaced 3 fence posts in the south field, and Elias showed him where the new timber growth had come in on the eastern edge of the hardwood stand. The young trees straight and close-spaced the way second growth came in, not yet the size of the old timber, but growing. On the Saturday evening of that visit, they walked out to the northwest corner at dusk. The excavation site was secured now, the hole covered with a steel plate the Army Corps had installed, the surrounding area marked with orange safety fencing. The maple grove stood bare above the covered ground. The old cattle wire fence he had put up 11 years ago was still there, off to the side, the T-posts leaning slightly. His son stood at the edge of the covered excavation and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Elias stood beside him and looked at it too. His son said, "Granddad walked past this every time he checked the northwest fence line." Elias said yes. His son said, "And never knew." "And never knew," Elias agreed. They stood there in the February dusk with the bare maples above them and the cold coming on and the covered hole between them and whatever was underground. The empty cave now, the shelf where the boxes had been, the flat compressed floor that was 80 years old and more. The farm was quiet the way it was always quiet in winter. The timber at the far edge was dark. A single crow crossed the sky above them going west, the way crows went at dusk, purposeful and unhurried. His son said, quietly, "I'm glad you didn't sell when it was bad." Elias said, "I know." His son said, "I'm glad you held it." Elias looked at the covered hole and at the maple grove and at the field stretching east toward the better ground where the grass would come back in spring and the timber would keep growing on its own time, as it always had, as it would continue to do, and he said, "So am I." The negotiation began formally in March. Calloway had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, methodically, without flourish, building a position from the ground up rather than from a number down. He had retained a financial historian from the University of Kentucky, a woman named Dr. Sandra Park, to produce a formal report on the historical value of the bonds and the appropriate methodology for calculating their present worth. He had retained an independent gold appraiser with auction house experience to establish the market value of the coins and bars. He had assembled the county records research, Elias's full ownership documentation going back to 1947, and the legal precedents from comparable discovery cases, of which there were few but enough. The government's team was led by a senior attorney from the Justice Department named Ambrose, a man in his early 60s who had done this kind of work for the government his entire career and who was, according to Calloway, very good at it. Calloway said this without apparent concern. He said the quality of the opposing counsel was not a reason for alarm, it was information. The first session was held in a federal building in Lexington on a cold March Tuesday. Elias was not present, by Calloway's instruction. He said his presence would complicate the atmosphere of the first session, which was about establishing the framework of the discussion rather than the substance, and that Elias's time would come. Elias stayed on the farm. He repaired a gate hinge in the south field that had been loose since autumn and hadn't mattered when the cattle were gone, but that he had decided to repair anyway on the principle that deferred maintenance was a habit he did not want to develop. He replaced 2 boards on the barn's south wall, where rot had gotten into them over the winter. He drove to the feed store in the afternoon and bought nothing because he did not need anything yet, but wanted the errand, wanted the motion, wanted the ordinary commerce of a day that had a shape he recognized. Calloway called that evening from Lexington. He said the first session had gone as expected. The government's position was, as anticipated, that the assets were federal property, specifically wartime operational funds that had been removed from authorized custody without clear legal sanction, and that the landowner's claim, while acknowledged, was secondary to the government's ownership interest. He said Ambrose had presented this position clearly and without aggression, which was a good sign. Aggressive opening positions indicated a party that was not confident in the middle game. Elias asked what Calloway had said. Calloway said he had presented the ownership documentation, the purchase history from 1948, the legal arguments about finders' rights in Kentucky, and the question of whether an unauthorized removal of funds constituted a valid basis for a government ownership claim when the removal had been made by a government employee who had subsequently died in service without ever formally acknowledging the removal. He said that last point was one he intended to develop further. The government's ownership claim rested on the chain of authorized custody. Sander had broken that chain. The government could argue the break was unauthorized, and therefore the funds remained government property. Calloway intended to argue that a break in the chain created by a government employee acting under extraordinary wartime circumstances, who had then died in service without opportunity to correct or explain his actions, was a more complex legal situation than the government's clean ownership argument acknowledged. Elias asked if that argument would work. Calloway said he did not know yet. He said it was an argument he believed in and intended to press, and that the government's willingness to continue the negotiation rather than simply assert federal ownership and let Elias sue them suggested they had some doubt about their own position's strength. The negotiation continued through March and into April. Calloway reported back after each session with the measured, informative summaries that Elias had come to rely on. The government was moving, slowly, from the position that the assets were entirely federal property to a position that acknowledged some portion of the value as properly belonging to Elias as the landowner and discoverer. The percentage being acknowledged grew in small increments across multiple sessions, which Calloway said was a normal pattern and an encouraging one. Elias maintained the farm. The spring came in its usual way, the grass returning to the south fields, the hardwood stand leafing out on the eastern slope, the sinkhole field greening around the Army Corps steel plate that covered the cave entrance. He had a conversation with the Corps about whether the plate needed to stay permanently or could be replaced with something less industrial once the formal process was complete. They said they would revisit that question when the legal process concluded. He planted a kitchen garden in April, the first time he had done so since his wife had left. He did not do it because of the money or the change in his circumstances. He did it because it was April and the ground was ready, and he had always meant to get back to growing his own tomatoes and had not, and there was no longer a good reason to put it off. His son came up for a week in April and helped with the planting and with a significant repair to the barn roof that Elias had been pricing contractors for. They did it themselves over 3 days, the way his father and he had done repairs, methodically, from the ridge down, replacing the damaged sections and checking the sound ones. It was hard physical work and satisfying in the way hard physical work on your own land was satisfying, the satisfaction of a thing that needed doing being done. On the last evening of his son's visit, they sat on the porch after dinner in the April dusk. The farm was green and quiet around them. The maple grove in the northwest was in full leaf, the trees that had stood bare and cold over the cave through the winter now full and rustling in the evening air. His son asked if he had thought about what he would do with the money when it came. Elias said he had thought about it some. His son waited. He said he wanted to pay off the line of credit. He wanted to repair the rear addition's roof. He wanted to put enough aside to cover operating costs for 5 years without having to worry about a bad season pulling him under. And he wanted to set aside something for the boy, enough that the decision about what to do with his life would not be constrained by money in a way that Elias's own decisions had sometimes been constrained. His son said that was generous. Elias said it was practical. He said the farm going to a second generation had always depended on whether the second generation could afford to take it on. He said he did not want that to be the deciding factor for his son, that the farm should go forward or not on its own merits, and on what his son wanted, not on whether he could carry the debt. His son was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I think I might want it. The farm. I've been thinking about it." Elias said nothing, but something in his chest loosened in a way it hadn't in a long time. His son said, "Not right now. I have 2 more years of school. But after. I've been thinking I might want to come back." Elias said, "Then it'll be here." They sat on the porch in the April evening until the light was gone and the stars came out over the Kentucky hills, over the timber and the south fields, and the maple grove in the northwest corner under which, 40 feet down in a cave carved out of limestone by water that had been moving through these hills for 10,000 years, the empty shelf sat where the boxes had been, in a dark that no one was in anymore. Quiet in the way that places are quiet when the thing they were holding has finally been released. The settlement was reached on a Thursday in late May, 8 days before the first anniversary of the sinkhole's original measurement that had told Elias it was growing. He was at the farm when Calloway called. He was in the south field checking the fence line along the eastern boundary, a job he did every spring as a matter of habit, walking the wire and looking for places where winter had worked the posts loose or deer had pushed through. He had his phone in his shirt pocket, and when it rang, he stopped walking and stood in the field with the grass at his knees and the timber on the slope above him and answered it. Calloway said, "We have a number." Elias said, "Tell me." He listened. He stood in the south field with the May sun on his back and the fence line running ahead of him through the grass toward the timber, and he listened to Calloway read the settlement terms in the careful, sequential way he read everything. The physical gold first, the coins at numismatic auction value with a premium agreed for the historical context of the collection, then the bars at current market price. Then the bonds, redeemed at 62% of face value with a negotiated interest calculation that stopped at 1980 rather than the present, which was a compromise from both the government's initial position of no interest and Calloway's initial position of full accrual. Then a finder's consideration, a formal payment acknowledging Elias's role as the discoverer and his cooperation throughout the process. Then a provision regarding the historical documents, which would be transferred to the National Archives, but with a formal acknowledgement of Elias's role in their recovery and a commitment to their inclusion in the public record rather than any classified filing. When Calloway finished reading, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said the total. Elias stood in the south field. He said, "Say that again." Calloway said it again. Elias looked at the fence line and at the timber on the slope and at the sky above the eastern ridge, which was the particular blue of a clear May morning, the kind of blue that does not seem real when you look at it directly. He stood there for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt longer. He said, "Is that after your fees?" Calloway said no, that was before his fees, which they had agreed were contingency-based and would be calculated separately, and that after fees the net figure to Elias would be somewhat less, but still substantially in the range of what he had just heard. Elias said, "All right." Calloway said, "All right? That's your response?" Elias said he was still standing in a field and hadn't quite put it together yet. Calloway laughed, which was something Elias had not heard him do before. He said that was a fair position and that there would be documentation to sign over the following week, and he would explain the process in full when they met. He said, "Congratulations, Elias, I mean that," and that he had been doing this work for 22 years, and this was the most unusual, and in some ways the most satisfying case he had handled. Elias thanked him and put the phone back in his shirt pocket and finished walking the fence line. He did not know what else to do with the next hour, and so he did what he had planned to do before the call, which was walk the wire and check the posts and note the places that needed attention. There were 3 sections where the staples had pulled and 2 posts that had worked loose enough to need resetting. He noted them on the small notepad he carried in his back pocket for this purpose and finished the line at the southeast corner where the timber began and then walked back up through the field toward the barn. He called his son from the porch. His son answered on the second ring. Elias told him the number. His son was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Dad." Elias said he knew. His son said, "That's." He stopped. He said, "Are you okay?" Elias said he was fine. He said he was sitting on the porch and the farm looked the same as it had looked that morning, which it did, and he was fine. His son said he was coming up this weekend. Elias said that was good. He said, "Drive careful." He sat on the porch after the call, and looked at the farm. The south fields were green. The barn roof was solid, the new boards they had put on in April already weathering to match the old ones. The kitchen garden was in, the tomatoes staked, the beans climbing. The maple grove in the northwest was in full leaf, dense and dark green, the steel plate of the Army Corps invisible from this distance, just the grove looking as it had always looked, ordinary and unchanged above what it had always been above. He thought about what he was going to do with the money. Not in the abstract way he had been turning it over for months, at arm's length, as a theoretical question. In the concrete way, now, with a number that was real and settled and documented in a federal agreement that Callaway was preparing for signature. Pay off the line of credit. That was $60,000, which was now a small fraction of the total, a fraction so small it was almost embarrassing to have carried it for 3 years as the weight that it had been. He would pay it off the first week. He would call the bank himself and give them the routing information himself and watch the balance go to zero the way you watch something you have been wanting to watch for a long time. Repair the rear addition. New roof, new windows. The foundation work on the northeast corner that a contractor had told him 2 years ago needed doing, but that he had deferred. He had always intended to do it. He had the house to keep. He would do it properly. The 5 years of operating reserves. He had thought about this carefully. Farming had bad years. It had always had bad years, and would continue to have them. The drought years, the hail year, the markets that moved against you without concern for your position. 5 years of covered operating costs meant that a bad year was a bad year and not an existential question. It meant decisions could be made on their merits rather than on the pressure of the immediate. Something for his son. He had thought about the amount. Not enough to remove the incentive to work, which was something he had read was a concern with inherited wealth, and which he considered a legitimate concern based on his observation of how people functioned. But enough to mean that the farm, if his son came back to it, would not begin with a debt load that made success unlikely before it started. Enough to mean his son could make the choice freely. And then there was the thing he had been thinking about since Fitch had sat on his tailgate and told him about Frederick Sander. Since he had found the death notice in the courthouse archive. Since he had looked at the photograph in the newspaper, the unclear face of a man in uniform who had died in an English hospital in 1944, 37 years old, no family, a corner of Kentucky farmland already gone from his name by then for 5 years. He had talked to Callaway about it, and Callaway had made inquiries, and the inquiries had produced, through the National Archives and through a military history research service that Callaway had engaged, a more complete picture of Frederick Sander than the death notice had contained. He had been born in 1907 in Knox County, which was 1 county over. He had grown up in the coal fields, which explained some things about his circumstances during the Depression. He had worked as a bookkeeper for a mining company in the 1930s. He had bought the land in Laurel County in 1931, apparently with the intention of farming it, though the record did not show that he had ever farmed it significantly. He had lost it in 1939 when a combination of low wages and bad timing had made the tax payment impossible. He had enlisted in 1942, at age 35, which was older than the typical enlistee and which, combined with his bookkeeping background, probably explained the warrant officer designation and the logistics posting rather than a combat role. He had been at the depot in southeastern Kentucky from 1942 to early 1944. He had then been reassigned in the context of the logistics support for the Normandy operation and had been wounded at some point in June or July of 1944, the exact date not clearly recorded, and had died in a military hospital in England in December of 1944. The research service had found one more thing. A letter in the National Archives, misfiled in a batch of administrative correspondence from the depot, never forwarded to the intended recipient because the intended recipient had died before the filing system was reorganized. The letter was from Sander to his commanding officer at the depot. It was dated April 1944, 2 months before the Normandy landings. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph was the formal language of a military communication, addressing the officer by rank, stating the purpose of the letter. The second paragraph described, in careful logistical language, the temporary relocation of certain operational funds to a secure location outside the depot facility, citing concerns about the security of the depot itself in the context of the build-up to the planned operation, which was at that point still classified though everyone in the logistics chain knew something major was coming. The language was specific about the location, which was described by coordinates that matched the northwest corner of what had been Sanders' land in Laurel County, and about the contents, which matched the inventory of what had been found in the cave. The third paragraph was different in tone from the first two. It was still formal, but something had shifted in it, some quality of the language that Calloway had described when he read it aloud to Elias over the phone as almost personal. Sander wrote that he understood the relocation required formal authorization that he had not obtained, and that he intended to obtain it retroactively upon the operation's completion or to return the funds to the depot directly if the operations timeline permitted. He wrote that the funds were secure and complete, and that his intention throughout had been the protection of government property rather than any other purpose. He wrote that he was aware the decision was irregular and accepted full responsibility for it. He wrote that if anything prevented him from completing the recovery himself, the location was documented in the letter, and he trusted his commanding officer to ensure the funds were properly recovered and accounted for. The letter had never been forwarded. The commanding officer it was addressed to had been killed at Normandy. The letter had sat in a misfiled batch of administrative correspondence for 80 years. Elias had asked Calloway, after hearing the letter, what it meant legally. Calloway had said it complicated the government's ownership claim in a way that actually worked in Elias's favor, because it established that Sander had believed himself to be acting in protection of government property rather than appropriating it, which was relevant to the character of the relocation, and because the failure of the letter to reach its recipient and the subsequent failure of any recovery effort was not Sander's failure, but a failure of the system that had been supposed to receive his communication. He had also said, and this was not the legal observation but the human one, that the letter made Frederick Sander a different figure than the one who appeared in the gaps of the record. Not a man who had stolen government money and hidden it on his old land. A man who had made a decision under operational pressure, had documented it, had tried to do it correctly within the limits of his situation, and had then been removed from the picture by the war before any of that could resolve. Elias had said he wanted to do something about that. Calloway had said he thought that was possible. He had made some preliminary inquiries of his own. What was possible, it turned out, was more than Elias had initially imagined. The settlement with the government included a provision, negotiated by Calloway in the final sessions, for a formal review of Sanders' military record in light of the recovered letter. The Army's Human Resources Command, after being presented with the letter and the context, had agreed to initiate a posthumous review. The process was slow and bureaucratic, the way military reviews were, but Calloway was confident it would result in a formal correction of the record, an acknowledgement that Sander had been acting in good faith, and that the irregularity in his action was the product of operational circumstances rather than personal misconduct. It would not change much in the practical sense. There was no one to receive the corrected record, no family to be notified, but it would exist, officially, in the file of a man who had died in an English hospital at 37 years old with no one to speak for him. And that seemed to Elias to matter in the way that things that cannot be changed but can be acknowledged matter. He had also, on his own initiative, contacted the Knox County Historical Society, which was the county where Sander had been born, and had arranged to provide a donation to support a permanent exhibit on the county's residents who had served in the Second World War. The exhibit would include Frederick Sander. It would include the photograph from the death notice and the basic facts of his service and his death and, at Elias's specific request, a plain account of what had been found on his old land in Kentucky in November of the previous year and why it was there. The Historical Society had been moved by this. The woman he had spoken to, the society's director, had asked why he wanted to do this for a man he had no connection to. Elias had said he had a connection to his land. She had understood that. The documentation signing happened the following week, a full day in Calloway's Lexington office, the kind of day that involved a great deal of paper and careful reading, and the particular deliberate quality of signing your name to things that have significant consequences. Calloway walked him through each document with the same methodical care he had applied to everything from the first meeting. Elias read what he signed, which was something Calloway had told him at the beginning was something he should always do, and which he had always done anyway. When it was finished, Calloway shook his hand and said the funds would transfer within 30 days to the account Elias had established for the purpose. He said it had been a genuine privilege. He said he meant that, and Elias believed him. Elias drove back to Laurel County through the May afternoon, The hills green on both sides of the road. The sky the same clear blue it had been when Calloway had called him in the South Field. He stopped in London for groceries and hardware without any particular reason except that it was where he stopped, and the habit of a life had its own momentum. He bought coffee and a bag of flour and a new pair of work gloves because his current pair had worn through at the right thumb. He paid with his debit card, which had the same balance it had had that morning, the settlement transfer not yet completed. He drove home. The news that the settlement had been reached traveled through the county in its usual way, and by the following week most of what needed to be known was known in the places where such things were known. The tone of the county's attention had shifted somewhat over the months. The initial excitement, the real estate people and the speculators and the distant claimants, had subsided as it became clear that Elias was not going to sell the land and was not going to be moved by pressure and was managing the situation through proper legal channels in a manner that left no opening for opportunists. What remained was a more straightforward community interest, the interest a small county takes in one of its own coming into an unusual circumstance and conducting themselves sensibly through it. Carl Pruitt came over again with a different bottle of bourbon, a better one this time, and sat at the kitchen table and said he was glad it had worked out and that he hoped Elias would not let it change him, which was a thing that only a man who knew you well enough to say such things without offense could say. Elias said he did not intend to let it change him. Pruitt said he didn't think it would. He said he'd watched Elias go through the divorce and the bad years and never seen him become different. He said some people got smaller under pressure, and some people got meaner, and some people just kept being who they were, and Elias was the third kind. They drank the better bourbon with appropriate restraint and talked about the timber market and Pruitt's daughter's baby, who was now 6 months old and apparently still remarkable. The transfer came through on a Wednesday, 31 days after the signing. Elias was in the barn when his phone notified him. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened the banking application on his phone and looked at the balance. The number was there. The actual number, the real one, in the account that had his name on it, and had previously contained amounts that were ordinary and sometimes uncomfortably small. He looked at it for a while. Then he opened the application for the line of credit and transferred the payoff amount. He watched the balance on the line of credit go from $61,412 to zero. The transfer was flagged as pending for 1 business day. He set the phone down. He made coffee. He called the contractor about the rear addition and scheduled an assessment for the following week. He had interviewed 3 contractors over the spring, without committing, keeping the possibility open. He called the one he had decided on, a woman who ran a small firm out of London and who had given him an estimate that was straightforward and honest about what the work required and had not tried to upsell him on anything he had not asked about. He called his son. His son answered on the second ring. Elias said, "The transfer came through." His son said, "How do you feel?" Elias thought about it. He said he felt about the same as he had felt before it came through, which was fine, which was the way he generally felt when things were as they should be. He said the line of credit was paid. He said the contractor was coming next week about the rear addition. He said he had thought more about the amount he wanted to set aside for him and had settled on a figure and would tell him when he came up. His son said, "Dad, you don't have to do that." Elias said he knew. He said he wanted to. His son was quiet for a moment. He said, "I've been talking to my advisor about the timeline for finishing." He said he might be able to finish a semester early if he took an extra course load in the fall. He said he had been thinking a lot about the farm. Elias said, "Take your time. Finish it right." His son said, "I know, but I've been thinking." Elias said, "The farm will be here." He said it the way he said things he was certain of, without emphasis, as a simple fact. The farm would be here. It had been here through his grandfather's time and his father's time, and through Elias's own time, through the divorce and the bad years, and the cattle going to auction, and the drought, and the hail, and the slow financial erosion of 4 consecutive difficult seasons. Through all of it, the farm had been here. It would be here when his son was ready. That was not optimism. That was the straightforward accounting of what his family had held and why, and what it meant to hold things worth holding. Summer came. The south fields were good that year, enough rain at the right times, the hay coming in well. He had not gone back to cattle and did not intend to immediately, but the fields needed cutting, and the hay had a buyer through a neighbor, and the arrangement worked. He was not farming in the full sense yet, was not sure he would again at the same scale, but the land was not idle, and that mattered to him. He walked the property in the evenings when the light was long, the June evenings that in Kentucky went on until 9 o'clock and made the hills look like something from a painting that was trying to be sentimental and happening to be right. He walked the south fields and the eastern slope where the timber was growing and the northwest corner where the maple grove was dense and full above the covered cave entrance. He had asked the Army Corps about the steel plate. They had said the structural assessment was complete and the cave was stable and there was no continuing safety concern, and that it was his decision what to do with the entrance. He had thought about it. He had talked to Dr. Hale, who was still in occasional contact and who had expressed an interest in the cave's formation as a geological specimen worth preserving. He had talked to Calloway, who said the legal question of the cave itself, separate from its contents, was straightforward. It was on his land. It was his. He decided to have it properly opened and stabilized rather than sealed. Dr. Hale was interested in being involved in that process. There was a possibility, which she had raised and which he had not dismissed, of eventually opening it to educational visits, the kind of guided access that some cave-rich farms in Kentucky offered, though that was a long way down the road and not something he was deciding yet. What he was deciding was that the cave should not be sealed back up. It had been sealed long enough. It was part of the land, and the land should know what it contained. He thought about that sometimes, the idea that the land had not changed when the cave was discovered. The gold had been there for 80 years while 3 generations of his family had walked above it. The cave had been there for far longer than that, 10,000 years or more by Dr. Hale's geological assessment. The water working through the limestone since the last glaciation, long before any human being had known this particular corner of Kentucky existed. The land had held all of it without being different from itself. He was different from himself, he supposed. Not in the ways the county might have expected, not in the ways the real estate people had assumed when they knocked on his gate, not in any way that had to do with the number in the account. The difference was harder to name and had less to do with money than with what the whole process had required of him. The steadiness, the patience, the decision made over and over across 8 months to stay where he was and be who he was and let the thing resolve on its own honest terms. He was not sure that was a change, exactly. It might have been something more like a confirmation. The kind of thing that tests do not create in you but reveal, showing you something that was already there and that you could not have been certain of until the test made it visible. He had told the Knox County Historical Society director, in one of their later conversations about the Sander exhibit, that the thing that struck him most about the whole affair was not the gold or the money but the fact of the letter. The letter Sander had written in April of 1944, carefully and formally, doing his best to document what he had done and why, trying to do it correctly, trusting the system to receive the communication and act on it. The system had failed to receive it. The misfiling of a single letter in a wartime administrative office had meant that Sander's careful accounting of himself, his effort to be responsible and transparent about a decision made under pressure, had gone unheard for 80 years. She had said that was a remarkable thing to focus on. He had said he kept thinking about the care of it. The letter had not been the letter of a man who had stolen something and was trying to cover himself. It had been the letter of a man who understood he had done something irregular, who could not undo it in the moment, and who was doing what he could do, which was document it clearly and trust that the documentation would reach someone who could act on it. The trust had been misplaced, through no fault of Sanders. But the act of trust, the decision to be accountable rather than simply silent, that had not been misplaced. It was still readable 80 years later. It still told you who he was. He thought there was something in that worth saying plainly, though he was not a man given to saying things plainly for their own sake. The thing was this. Frederick Sander had died at 37 in an English hospital with nothing to his name, his land gone, his letter unread, the funds he had tried to protect sitting in the dark under Kentucky limestone, where they would stay for 8 more decades. By any ordinary accounting he had lost. He had done what he believed was right, and it had not been acknowledged, and it had not been rewarded, and from the outside, from the perspective of a man looking at the record in a courthouse archive, there was not much to find there except loss. But the letter was still the letter. The accountability it represented was still what it was. The fact that the system failed to receive it did not change what it said about the man who wrote it. And 80 years later, when the system had finally gotten around to reading it, it still told the truth about him. The truth had waited. Elias found that worth something. He found it worth quite a lot, actually. More than he had expected to find worth that much when he had first sat on his tailgate with Fitch in November and heard the name Frederick Sander for the first time. His son came back to the farm at the end of August, between semesters, for 10 days. They did not do anything in particular. They fixed the fence line on the south field properly, the 3 sections he had noted in May, resetting the posts and tightening the wire. They cleared a section of the driveway where the drainage had been running wrong for 2 years and was starting to erode the gravel. They drove out to the cave entrance one morning and walked around the covered excavation and talked about what Dr. Hale had said about the geology and how the opening process would work. His son crouched at the edge of the steel plate and put his hand flat on it for a moment, the way you touch something you are trying to understand through contact. He said, "Do you ever think about Sander?" Elias said, "Yes, some." His son said, "What do you think about?" Elias said he thought about the letter mostly. He said he thought about a man sitting down in April of 1944 to write a careful letter about something irregular he had done, knowing it was irregular, trying to account for it, trusting that the accounting would reach the right person. He said he thought about the fact that the letter had been found in a misfiled batch of documents 80 years later, which meant it had sat somewhere all that time, unread, unacted on, waiting to be found. His son said, "That's a long time to wait." Elias said, "It got found." His son looked at the covered entrance to the cave where the boxes had been and where the limestone shelf was and where, deeper, the walls of karst limestone ran down into the geological time of the earth itself. He said, "It's strange to think it was here the whole time." "All of it?" Elias said, "Yes." His son said, "You walked past this your whole life." Elias said, "I fenced it off when you were small, kept you away from it." His son was quiet. Then he said, "You kept the farm through all of it. The bad years." Elias said, "I did." His son said, "I want to understand that. What kept you?" Elias thought about it. He said it was not any single thing. He said it was partly the debt, the disinclination to lose what he owed on, the stubborn arithmetic of a man who did not want to leave with less than he had started with. He said it was partly the habit of the land, the way a man who has worked the same ground for decades develops a relationship with it that is not quite like other relationships, that does not need justification and does not respond well to abstract argument. He said it was partly his father and his grandfather, the accumulated weight of people who had held the same ground before him and who he did not want to be the one who let go. And then he said, "It was partly just that I believed it was worth keeping, not because of what it was worth, though I knew it had value, but because it was ours and it was a good piece of ground, and those two things together seemed like enough reason. You don't always need more reason than that." His son stood up from his crouch beside the cave entrance and looked at the maple grove and at the field and at the farm in the August light. He said, "I'm going to come back in the spring, after I finish." Elias said, "I know." His son said, "And I'm going to learn the timber side properly. I've been reading about sustainable harvest." Elias said that was good. He said the timber was the part of the operation that had been most consistently sound over the years, the slow money. The money that required patience but did not fail in bad rain years or get eaten by the market the way cattle did. He said he had not managed it as well as he could have because of the time the other operations required, and that there was room to do it better. His son said, "We'll do it better." Elias said yes. They walked back through the maple grove toward the farm. The August light came through the canopy in the particular way it did in late summer, heavy and golden, not the sharp light of June, but the weighted light of a season beginning its turn. The leaves were still full, but there was something in the air that would become autumn in 6 weeks. The first suggestion of the change that was coming, not yet visible, but present the way things were present before they were visible, in the quality of the light and the particular smell of the morning and the way the shadows fell at midday. Elias walked through it and thought about springs. The spring his grandfather had come home with the deed to the northwest parcel in 1948, and what that spring had looked like, the grove already established by then, the sinkhole already there though nobody had named it or measured it. The spring his father had planted the south fields and winter wheat for the first time, which had been a good decision that the farm had continued for a decade. The springs of his own adult years on the land, the springs that had followed bad winters, and the springs that had followed bad autumns, and the springs that had simply followed other springs without requiring a story. There would be another spring. His son would come back to it. The farm would be different for having someone younger on it, someone with 20 more years of physical energy, and the specific hunger of a person returning to something they had chosen rather than inherited by default. It would be the same farm, the same ground, the same timber on the eastern slope and the same south fields, and the same northwest corner with the maple grove above the cave that had held its secret for 80 years and was now an open fact, part of the land's record the way everything that happened on a piece of ground became part of its record eventually. The drought years and the good years, and the man who had put the boxes in the cave, and the sinkhole that had grown in the wet autumn, and the farmer who had rented an excavator and punched through a limestone shelf into a dark that turned out to contain more than darkness. It was all the record now, all of it part of what the land was. The 340 acres his grandfather had assembled across two transactions in 1947 and 1948, the good growing ground and the timber and the northwest corner with its karst geology and its cave and its 80-year-old secret and its sinkhole that had been there the whole time. Patient as limestone is patient, waiting for the weight of water and time to open it. The settlement. Funds had gone to the things he had said they would go to. The line of credit was paid. The rear addition had its new roof and its new windows and its repaired foundation, the work completed by September, the house tight before winter in a way it had not been in years. The operating reserves were set aside in a structure Callaway had helped him establish, 5 years of coverage, the kind of financial floor that meant a bad year was something to work through rather than something to fear. His son had received what Elias had set aside for him, which his son had not touched and would not touch until he came back to the farm and could put it to work in the ground rather than let it sit in an account being theoretical. The Knox County Historical Society exhibit had opened in October, a modest opening in a modest building. A dozen people from the county historical community and a few journalists and Elias himself, who had driven the 40 minutes to Knox County to see the exhibit and to stand in front of the photograph of Frederick Sander, which was now mounted properly and labeled properly and accompanied by a 3-paragraph account of who he had been and what he had done and what had come of it 80 years later. He had stood in front of it for a while. The photograph was the same one from the death notice, the unclear face of a man in uniform, but it had been enhanced by the Society's archivist and was somewhat clearer than the newspaper reproduction. He was a lean man with high cheekbones and a direct look at the camera of the kind that suggested the photograph had been taken at his initiative rather than someone else's. He was wearing his warrant officer's uniform. He looked like a man who had worked hard for most of his life and expected to continue doing so, which was probably accurate. Elias stood in front of the photograph and did not say anything. There was nothing to say to a photograph of a man who had been dead for 80 years and for whom everything that needed doing had now been done. The record had been corrected. The story had been told. The letter had been read, finally, by the people who were supposed to read it, and the accounting it contained had been accepted. Sander had done what he could do in April of 1944, and the rest had taken 80 years to catch up. The Historical Society director had stood beside him for a moment and said, "It's remarkable that you did this." Elias had said it was the right thing to do. She had said that might be the simplest and most complete explanation she had heard for anything in a long time. He had driven home through the October hills, the leaves coming down in Knox County the same way they were coming down in Laurel County, the same season, the same turning, the air with the particular clarity of October in the mountains. He had driven with the heater on his side of the truck working the way it always did and the passenger side silent, the old familiar asymmetry, and he had thought about the year that had just passed and what it had contained. The sinkhole had been there for years. He had known it the way a man knows the bad tooth. He had fenced it off and worked around it and noted its slow growth with the practical attention of a farmer who monitors his land the way a body monitors its own condition, habitually, without drama. He had rented the excavator not because he had any expectation of what was underneath, but because the sinkhole was growing and needed addressing, and he was a man who addressed things that needed addressing when he had the means to do so. The bucket had gone through the shelf. The rest had followed. He pulled into his driveway and parked and sat for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled, looking at the farmhouse. The rear addition had new windows that caught the October light differently than the old ones had, a small and pleasant difference. The kitchen garden had been put to bed for the winter, the beds cleared and mulched. The barn was solid against the evening sky, the new roof boards indistinguishable now from the old ones. The maple grove in the northwest was at its autumn peak, the leaves red and gold above the covered entrance to the cave. Beautiful in the way that October maples in Kentucky are beautiful, which is without restraint, which is as much color as a tree can carry before the cold takes it. He went inside and made dinner. He ate at the kitchen table. He washed up and put the dishes away and made coffee and sat with it until it was gone. He thought about what he wanted to do tomorrow, which was to finish the drainage work on the north fence line before the weather turned. A straightforward task that would take most of the morning. He thought about the winter coming and the things that needed doing before it arrived and the things that could wait until spring. He thought about his son coming back in the spring. He sat with that for a while, the simple fact of it. The farm going forward. The next generation already choosing it, already thinking about the timber and the sustainable harvest and what the ground could sustain over time. The story continuing the way stories continued when the people in them kept making the choice to hold what was worth holding. Outside, the October dark had settled in fully. The farm was quiet the way it was always quiet after dark. The sounds of it familiar and specific, the particular creak of the barn in wind, the sound of the creek at the south boundary when the water was up, the owl in the far timber that was back again this year, or one like it, calling from somewhere in the hardwoods with the unhurried authority of a creature that had worked out its relationship with the dark and found it satisfactory. Elias finished his coffee and rinsed the cup and went to bed. The farm was 340 acres in Laurel County, Kentucky. The south fields were in hay. The eastern slope was in hardwood timber, second growth coming in strong. Beside the older stand, the northwest corner had a maple grove that turned extraordinary colors in October and a cave beneath it that had held a wartime secret for 80 years and was now open, known, part of the record. The record was complete, or as complete as such things got. The letter had been read. The man who wrote it had been acknowledged. The funds had been settled, the legal process finished, the accounts balanced. The land had been kept. The family had held it. 3 generations had walked above a cave they did not know was there, working the ground, putting things in and taking things out, the slow commerce of farming the same earth across a long time. None of them had known. All of them had contributed, by staying, by holding, by choosing the next season over the immediate alternative of leaving, to the moment when the bucket went through the shelf and the dark below was no longer sealed. Elias had not done anything extraordinary. He had done what farmers do, which is pay attention to the ground, address what needs addressing, hold what is worth holding, and not sell when the pressure is on if you believe the thing has value beyond what the pressure is measuring. He had done it for his reasons, and those reasons had been ordinary enough. Debt and stubbornness and the accumulated presence of the people who had worked the same ground before him. The ordinary reasons had been enough. The cave had done the rest. The spring his son came back was a wet one. March came in with rain that softened the south fields past what was workable and lingered into April, keeping them off the ground until the 3rd week when the clay finally firmed enough to take weight without churning. It was the kind of start that would have felt threatening a year ago, the kind that made a man calculate how many days he had before the planting window closed, and what a late start cost him in yield, and what that cost meant against the operating line. It did not feel threatening now. The reserves were there. The calculation was the same calculation, but without the weight behind it, the pressure that had attended every weather decision for 4 years running. The rain was just rain. The late start was just a late start. They would plant when the ground was ready. His son arrived on the 2nd Saturday of April with his truck loaded and a particular look about him. The look of a person who has made a decision and is living in the early days of it when the decision still feels large and the future is not yet routine. Elias had seen that look before, had worn it himself at 22 when he had come back from 2 years at the agricultural college in Lexington and driven down the county road to the farm with everything he had in the cab of a borrowed pickup. They shook hands at the gate, which was something they had not done before, and both of them understood what it meant. It meant something had been transferred, or was being transferred, not completely and not in any formal sense, but in the way transfers happened between fathers and sons on farms, gradually, through the accumulation of seasons and decisions shared, the older man stepping back by increments as the younger one stepped forward. They drove into the house. His son had been given the room at the back of the rear addition, newly repaired, with the new windows that looked out toward the eastern timber slope. He had been given a set of keys to everything. He had been given access to the operating accounts and the timber records and the hay contracts and the drainage maps. He had been given the folder of legal documents from the settlement, not because he needed them now, but because they were part of the record and the record was his to know. The first week they walked every acre of the property together, the way Elias's father had walked it with him when he came back from college. Not mapping it or assessing it, just walking it. The older man pointing out things that didn't show on paper, the spring that ran along the east boundary in wet years and went dry in drought years, the section of the south field where the soil changed character about 30 feet in from the fence line and behaved differently in wet springs. The place in the timber where a storm had taken down a large oak 2 years back, and the gap in the canopy was bringing in good growth that would be worth managing in 10 years or so. They walked the northwest corner last. The maple grove was in early leaf, the pale green of maples in April, the specific tentative color that preceded the full leaf of May. The steel plate over the cave entrance had been replaced the previous fall with a proper fitted hatch, flush with the ground, hinged and lockable, the kind of thing that marked the entrance as a feature rather than a hazard. Dr. Hale's formal cave assessment was complete and on file. The stabilization work was scheduled for the summer. His son unlocked the hatch and looked down into the cave. Elias had rigged a proper ladder and a lighting system the previous winter, basic but functional. They went down together. In the electric light, the cave was the same as it had always been: the limestone walls, the flat compressed floor, the long shelf along the southern wall where the 7 boxes had sat for 80 years. The shelf was empty now, had been empty since November of the previous year, but it was still clearly a shelf, still clearly a surface that had held things, the slightly different coloration of the stone where the metal had rested against it visible if you knew to look for it. His son ran his hand along the shelf without touching what was no longer there. He said, "It's smaller than I imagined." Elias said most things were. His son looked at the full length of the cave, the walls and the ceiling and the floor, the whole enclosed underground space that had been sealed and dark for 80 years while the farm went about its life above. He said, "It's strange to be in it. Now that it's just a cave." Elias said he understood that. He said it was strange in the other direction too, standing in it now, knowing what had been here, knowing the story of how it had come to be here and why, and the 80 years it had taken to surface. He said strange was probably the right word. They climbed back out into the April morning. His son locked the hatch, and they stood in the maple grove in the new leaf light, the particular green of early April filtering through the canopy. And Elias felt the season the way he felt seasons on this ground, through the specific sensory record of having been in this same grove in this same season many times. The smell of the leaf mold and the wet clay and the new growth, the sound of the grove moving in the April wind. His son said, "Thank you for holding it." Elias said it was his farm too. His son said, "I know, but you held it through the part when it was just cost, when it was just a thing that kept asking something of you without giving much back. That's the part that was yours to do." Elias looked at the grove and at the field beyond it. He said he supposed that was right. He said he had not thought of it in those terms at the time. He said at the time it had just been the farm, the thing that needed doing, the ground that was his to work and keep. It had not felt like a choice in the way his son was describing it. It had felt more like a fact. His son said, "That's what makes it the thing it is." They walked back through the grove and out into the south field, which was still too wet to work, but would not be for much longer. The sun was making progress on the April moisture. By next week the ground would be ready. By the week after, if the weather held, they would be in it. The farm waited, the way it always waited, patient in the way that ground was patient, the way stone was patient, the way the limestone beneath the field was patient, shaped by water over 10,000 years into chambers and passages and shelves that held what was placed on them and gave it back when the time was right. The time had been right in November. The spring was coming in now. Elias walked his farm in the April morning with his son beside him. The two of them moving through the same ground 3 generations of his family had moved through, and felt the accumulated weight of it not as a burden but as what it was, which was the record of people who had stayed, who had worked the same earth across time, who had held what was worth holding and passed it forward to the next person who would hold it, and who would pass it forward in turn, season by season, year by year. The way farms went on when the people in them understood what they had been given and chose, each in their own time and for their own reasons, to keep it. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.